Hi. When we last left off, the Israelites had made it to Egypt with the help of their oh-so-merciful and loving God. But while in Egypt, the Israelites would be fruitful and multiply over the course of the next 400 years. They would become a sizable minority within Egypt, and everything would be fine until one day when Yaldabaoth began to give the Pharaoh vivid dreams of a disaster. And so the Pharaoh enslaved the Israelites and slaughtered the male babies. Yaldabaoth, loving irony, put his totally original and not at all plagiarized plan into action, and one of the babies would survive when his mother puts him in a basket and hid him among the reeds on the riverbank of the Nile. The daughter of the Pharaoh finds this baby and adopts him as her own. The boy would be named Moses and grows up, and one day learns the truth that he is in fact a Jew. This leads to an identity crisis, which ultimately culminates when he sees an Egyptian man abusing a Hebrew slave and kills him. At first, Moses thinks he did a good thing, helping one of his people, but then the next day, some Hebrews run away from him, calling him a murderer. So being rejected by his people, and now wanted for murder, Moses flees Egypt and wanders the wilderness, ending up in the land of Midian. While in his exile, Moses meets some nice people and starts a new life, and lives happily ever after. That is, of course, until Yaldabaoth puts his plan for Egypt into action. 40 years after Moses flees Egypt, Moses is now a shepherd and leads a flock of his sheep to Mount Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai. While there, Yaldabaoth appears to Moses in the form of a burning bush. Yaldabaoth tells Moses that he is the God of his ancestors, Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac, and that he needs Moses to lead his people out of Egypt into the land of Canaan. Moses initially tries to reject this plan because he has no idea who this God is that's talking to him. Yaldabaoth tells him his name is simply I Am, probably out of jealousy for the fact that he is not the most powerful God, and bans Moses and the Israelites from using any variation of the word God or God Most High. Yaldabaoth continues his demands by telling Moses his plan of action. After giving Moses a brief rundown, Moses returns to his wife and sons, and they begin their trek back to Egypt. On the way back to Egypt, Yaldabaoth gets mad at Moses for some reason and tries to kill him, but Moses' wife offers the foreskin of her son as a sacrifice to Yaldabaoth, saying, "Truly, you are a bridegroom of blood to me." And for whatever reason, this gets Yaldabaoth to stop. This isn't something that was inserted by the Gnostics. This just randomly happens in Exodus chapter 4, verses 24 through 26. No one knows why God tries to kill Moses in this scene. Even the Gnostics couldn't come up with a reason. It just happens and is never addressed again. Anyway, after this fiasco, Yaldabaoth gives Moses more details on the plan. Moses will go to Pharaoh and ask for 3 days off for all of the Jews so they can make a sacrifice to him in the wilderness. While on their 3-day vacation, they would escape. But before that could happen, Pharaoh would say no, and God would hit Egypt with 10 plagues, each worse than the last. Moses asks Yaldabaoth 2 questions. First, why lie about leaving Egypt for only 3 days if the Jews plan to all leave forever? And why 10 plagues? Surely Pharaoh would give up after 1 or maybe 2. Yaldabaoth completely dodges the first question and tells Moses that Pharaoh will see all 10 plagues. If for whatever reason Pharaoh tries to back off before then, he'll harden his heart so that Pharaoh won't relent and let them go. Moses once again asks why this is at all necessary, but Yaldabaoth never gives a straight-up answer. So after arriving in Egypt, Moses meets with his brother Aaron, and the two of them go to the elders of Israel and fill them in on the plan. Then, Moses and his brother go to the Pharaoh and ask for the 3-day vacation from work. The Pharaoh says no and decides to make the slave labor for the Israelites more difficult. Aaron then throws his staff on the ground, and Yaldabaoth turns it into a snake. Pharaoh gets his sorcerers to do the same with their staffs, and they also turn into snakes. Then Aaron's staff eats their staffs. All according to Yaldabaoth's plan, the Israelites are suffering even worse, and thus he begins the 10 plagues. First, he turns the water of the Nile into blood. Pharaoh says no. Second, frogs. Pharaoh then agrees to let the Jews have their 3-day break if Moses makes the frogs go away. Moses asks Yaldabaoth to oblige, and the frogs disappear. But Pharaoh then immediately reneges on this deal, and so the 3rd plague. Lice. Pharaoh says no. Flies. Pharaoh says no. Pestilence. Pharaoh says no. Boils. And it's at this point that Pharaoh finally gives up and lets the Jews leave. But Yaldabaoth isn't done torturing the Egyptians, as barely anyone has died so far. So he hardens Pharaoh's heart, and Pharaoh once again refuses to let the Jews go, and thus the plagues continue. Hail. Pharaoh says no. Locusts. Pharaoh says no. Darkness. Pharaoh says no. And for the final plague, Yaldabaoth sent the Archon of Death down to Egypt and killed the firstborn son of every house that did not paint the doors with the blood of a lamb. The next day, across Egypt, the cries of millions were heard over the genocide. And finally, after 10 plagues, Yaldabaoth allowed Pharaoh to let the Jews go. But there was one part of the plan that Yaldabaoth forgot to mention to Moses. And so, over the next several hours, the Israelites would plunder the land of Egypt of its gold and jewels under the command of Yaldabaoth. And then, following the lead of Yaldabaoth, the Israelites would be led out of Egypt as Yaldabaoth traveled as a pillar of clouds. And he marched them towards the Red Sea. The Israelites began to get nervous because this is the wrong way, and Yaldabaoth assures them that this is all a part of the plan. Meanwhile, back in Egypt, Yaldabaoth hardened the hearts of the Egyptians and enticed them to attack the Israelites. Pharaoh and the Egyptians would then take 600 chariots to chase after the Israelites. As they are stuck between the Egyptians and the Red Sea, the pillar of clouds moves between them. Moses then lifts his staff, and the Red Sea parts ways. The Israelites are allowed to pass through, and once they are far enough, the Egyptians follow suit. Yaldabaoth unparts the sea, drowning all of the Egyptians. From here, it should have been a short distance to the Promised Land, but the trip was made to feel a lot longer because of the complaining of the Israelites. But also, under the command of Yaldabaoth, they would make a quick stop at Mount Sinai for what should have been a brief break. However, shenanigans ensued. Once they arrive at Mount Sinai, Yaldabaoth calls Moses to go up the mountain so that they could speak together. And so Moses leaves Aaron in charge and climbs the mountain, and Moses began to speak to his God. Yaldabaoth tells Moses that it is time he fulfilled his promise and delivered the Jews to the Promised Land. But before he could do that, he needed one thing, and that thing being a place of worship for Yaldabaoth, the tabernacle. And so Yaldabaoth would spend the next several days explaining in great detail on how to build the tabernacle. Seriously, a good chunk of Exodus is just spent describing this thing in intricate detail. And once Moses had memorized the right kind of seal skin to use for the tabernacle, Yaldabaoth began dictating his commandments. Meanwhile, at the base of the mountain back with Aaron, the Israelites constructed an idol in the shape of a bull, made out of the gold they had stolen from the Egyptians. When Moses returned with the stone tablets he engraved the 10 Commandments on, he saw the idol and was overtaken with rage and smashed the tablets, and returned to the top of the mountain. Once Moses had returned to the top, he informed Yaldabaoth of what he had just seen. Yaldabaoth becomes infuriated and decides to kill everyone there. Moses would spend the next several hours trying to calm Yaldabaoth down, and the two eventually came to an agreement. Yaldabaoth would only kill the people who constructed and were actively worshipping the idol, instead of everyone there. And so Yaldabaoth killed some of the Israelites. And from here, the Israelites would spend the next several days building the tabernacle, as Moses described to them, and the spirit of Yaldabaoth would inhabit it. But because Yaldabaoth was still being emotional about the whole bull idol incident, he produced a blinding light while inside the tabernacle, and the light was so bright that Moses couldn't look directly at it. Moses would spend the next several days trying to help Yaldabaoth get over the whole incident, but Yaldabaoth was in a mood and kept playing hard to get. One day, however, Aaron's sons used foreign fire when doing a sacrifice to Yaldabaoth. This angers Yaldabaoth, and so he decides to burn them to death. This act of senseless murder seemed to be just the thing that Yaldabaoth needed to get his spirits back into shape. And Moses was finally allowed to enter the tabernacle. Except he had to clean the ash piles that were once his nephew's. Yaldabaoth didn't want the sealskin covering to get dirty. Inside the tabernacle, Yaldabaoth tells Moses that the Israelites need to properly worship him, and lays out several needlessly complex rituals and arbitrary laws for them to follow, which make up most of Leviticus. After doing this for a while, Yaldabaoth was finally calmed down and lets Moses into the tent. Just cut that part out, that doesn't make sense. After spending an entire year at Mount Sinai, and dealing with Yaldabaoth's mood swings, the Israelites were finally back on track to the land of Canaan. But immediately the Israelites begin to complain to Moses once again. And after much complaining, the Israelites arrived at the wilderness of Paran. Moses sends some spies ahead to scout the Holy Land, but when the scouts return, they report that the land of Canaan is full of big, scary warriors. The Israelites refuse to enter the Promised Land, since they don't trust Yaldabaoth to protect them from the big, scary warriors, and in all honesty, not burning them to death for some arbitrary thing that they may or may not have known about beforehand. Yaldabaoth is hurt by this lack of loyalty and tells the Israelites that they will not enter the Promised Land, and they are thus sent to wander the desert for 40 years. And over the next 40 years, the Israelites would have several misadventures. At one point, a group called the Levites tried to rebel, so Yaldabaoth smited them. At one point, the Israelites would run out of water, so Yaldabaoth tells Moses to tap a stone with his staff so that water will come out. Moses does this and takes partial credit for the miracle. Yaldabaoth decides to put Moses into his place and tells him that he also won't enter the Promised Land either, thus ending Moses and Yaldabaoth's friendship. As the Israelites wandered the desert, they would not stop complaining, with many of them asking to go back to Egypt. Yaldabaoth, in a fit of rage, then sends snakes to attack them. Moses begs Yaldabaoth for mercy. Yaldabaoth takes pity on them, and tells Moses to build a bronze staff with a snake on it, and anyone who looks at that snake would have their snake bites healed. Another time, they would reach the plains of Moab, where a pagan king named Balaam tries to curse the Israelites, but Yaldabaoth won't let him. But after all of those misadventures, and after 40 years, the Israelites once again return to the edge of the Promised Land, and Moses gives his final sermon among the new generation, after which he walks up on top of a mountain and dies. So the Gnostics really didn't do extensive commentaries past the book of Exodus, but there were still some comments on various passages on the Old Testament, which, to the ancient Gnostics, was proof that the Old Testament God was evil. And we know which of these verses were used by the Gnostics because of what the early church fathers said about them. So let's do a quick lightning round for the rest of the Old Testament. Throughout the book of Joshua, Yaldabaoth has the Israelites invade the land of Canaan, slaughtering many innocent people in the process. The book of Judges is basically a cycle of the Israelites and Yaldabaoth bickering back and forth. In 1 Samuel, Yaldabaoth outright calls for genocide. Also in 1 Samuel, Yaldabaoth puts an evil spirit inside King Saul so that he would try to kill David. In 1 Kings, we get a detailed description of the throne of God, and how he operates, as he's planning to murder King Ahab. It reads a lot like a mafia gang, with each angel giving different ideas on how to do it, and God contemplating which one is the best course of action. In 2 Kings, the prophet Elijah calls on an angel in the name of Jehovah, and it brings down fire from heaven and consumes 2 captains and 100 men while they beg for mercy. This is multiple war crimes, by the way. Also in 2 Kings, a group of 42 children make fun of the prophet Elisha, calling him bald. Yaldabaoth responds by sending 2 bears to maul them to death. Elisha was in fact bald, by the way. There's also the entirety of the book of Job, which is basically just a bet between God and the devil to see if Job is actually loyal enough to stay with God after having all of his stuff burned and his family killed. There's also the fact that in the book of Job, Satan is among God's angels in the heavenly council. There's the infamous line in Isaiah where God literally says that he is the creator of evil. In Ezekiel, he admits to deliberately tricking his prophets. In Jonah, he apologizes and admits fault for having committed evil acts, something he does surprisingly throughout the entirety of the Bible. And it's for reasons like this that Gnostics like Valentinus didn't actually consider Yahweh to be wholly evil. And that covers the Old Testament. Tune in next time for the arrival of Jesus and his final battle with Yaldabaoth.